Hello, everyone. Today we're taking a closer look at a case where the most obvious answers hide a complete breakdown of the justice system. When I first started digging through this investigation, piecing together the timeline and reading the police reports, one question kept running through my mind. How could an entire country ignore someone for years when he had been showing exactly what he was capable of? I'll give you a spoiler. The answer is probably going to leave you frustrated. We tend to think of bureaucracy and negligence as abstract problems, but in this case, they became a very real weapon. But let's start at the beginning. I've gathered only the verified facts for you. Get comfortable. We're heading to South America. June 16th, 2024. Cordoba, Argentina. It's a Sunday, and across the country, people are celebrating Father's Day. Families are getting together, planning holiday lunches, and calling relatives throughout the day. The General Paz neighborhood, where our story begins, is considered one of the city's quieter, more desirable places to live. Inside an apartment building at 1061 Catamarca Street, residents were expecting nothing more than a peaceful holiday weekend. Around noon, that routine is suddenly interrupted by disturbing noises. Neighbors begin hearing screams coming from one of the apartments. This doesn't sound like a typical argument. The sounds of a struggle and repeated heavy impacts are enough to bring residents out into the hallway. Realizing that someone inside may be experiencing serious aggression, they immediately call emergency services and demand that officers be sent to the building. And this is where we run into the first detail that doesn't fit the way most people would expect a crime like this to unfold. Pay close attention to what happens next. At almost the exact same moment, the emergency dispatcher receives another call. The caller gives the very same address the neighbors had just reported, 1061 Catamarca Street. But there's one major difference. This call is coming from a man who is inside the very apartment where the screams were heard. And he's also asking for police officers to come immediately. You have to admit, that's an incredibly unusual reaction for someone whose apartment is at the center of such a violent confrontation. The Cordoba Police Department responds to the two emergency calls as quickly as possible. Officers arrive at the apartment complex, enter the building, and make their way to apartment 1A. They knock on the door, not yet knowing what they're about to walk into, or who is waiting on the other side. The door opens. Standing in the doorway is a man. According to the official reports, he appears extremely distressed, breathing heavily and visibly disoriented. But one detail immediately catches the officer's attention. Both of his hands are covered in blood. Even so, he doesn't yell. He doesn't try to confront the officers, and he doesn't make any attempt to run. Instead, he silently steps aside and motions for the officers to follow him toward the bedroom. The officers step inside. In the bedroom, they find a scene that immediately explains the screams the neighbors had reported. A young woman is lying on the bed. Someone has carefully covered her with a jacket. On the bedroom floor, investigators find 3 kitchen knives lying nearby. Paramedics arrive within minutes and examine her, but there's nothing they can do. They confirm there is no pulse and pronounce the young woman deceased at the scene. According to the initial findings, the most severe injuries were concentrated around her neck. As investigators began documenting the scene, they had no idea that the name of the man they had just taken into custody would soon spark an international scandal. The man with blood covering his hands, the only living person inside that apartment, is immediately taken into custody and removed from the scene. After going through all the available case files, I can tell you this. The way he behaved during his arrest wasn't simply shock. It followed a calculated pattern, one he had been refining for years. At first glance, it looks like a case that could have been solved that very day. The suspect is found at the scene, The weapons are still on the floor, and the evidence seems straightforward. But in reality, this is only the beginning. Who was this young woman? And why was her family expecting her at a Father's Day, gathering somewhere else? Why did the suspect call for police officers while standing just feet away from her body? And most importantly, as investigators would later discover, this man should never have been in Argentina in the first place. To understand how all of this happened, we need to rewind the story. We'll cross the border into the neighboring country and take a closer look behind the gates of some of its wealthiest neighborhoods, where influence and money repeatedly proved stronger than the law. 13 years before the young woman was found in that apartment in Argentina, the real story begins in neighboring Chile. Meet Hernan Felipe Herrera Larenas, born in 1985. He came from a wealthy family in the Chilean capital of Santiago. His father worked in high-level finance, while his mother, Maria Teresa Larenas, served as an attorney for the local police court in the affluent district of Las Condes. His uncle was also a well-connected attorney, always prepared to protect the family's interests, no matter the circumstances. Felipe carefully built an image of success that looked flawless from the outside. In 2008, he graduated from the prestigious Catholic University of Chile with a degree in commercial engineering. During college, he earned strong grades and stood out for his athletic achievements. Over the next 13 years, he steadily climbed the ladder in corporate finance, holding senior positions at an investment bank and later at a major fruit export company. Looking at his background on paper, you see what seems like the textbook profile of a successful man from an influential family. I spent a long time going through those dry records, asking myself one simple question. Where does this kind of uncontrollable aggression come from when everything appears so perfect? The answer was buried in police files that his family had worked hard to keep out of public view. It turns out that as early as 2011, the first official complaints accusing the engineer of aggressive behavior were filed by former partners. None of those reports ever moved forward. Then, in 2013, another incident took place at a nightclub in Santiago. A young woman named Carla was there with her boyfriend and a group of friends. Felipe approached her and repeatedly insisted that she dance with him. When she refused, he grabbed her around the waist by force. Carla reacted by throwing her drink in his face. Felipe immediately picked up a glass and slammed it into her face, leaving her with serious cuts near one of her eyes. A large fight broke out between Carla's friends and Felipe's group, and people from both sides ended up in the hospital. But once again, the case quietly disappeared. Authorities minimized what had happened. Investigators argued that because Carla had not lost her eyesight, the offense did not qualify as a particularly serious crime. Influential relatives stepped in. Carla received financial compensation, and the man accused of the attack simply walked away without ever spending time behind bars. Nearly 8 years later, that sense of complete impunity had only grown stronger. In June 2020, Felipe began a relationship with Jael Emilia Vitran Becerra. According to her testimony, he displayed an extreme level of jealousy. He constantly interrogated her about past relationships and would become enraged over people she hadn't even spoken to in years. Even so, on February 17th, 2021, the couple decided to move in together and shared an apartment. That same evening, they attended a birthday party for a friend, where Felipe started drinking alcohol despite previously claiming he was taking strong prescription medication. After they returned home that night, another argument fueled by jealousy quickly escalated. What began as a verbal confrontation turned into serious physical aggression. According to the investigation, Felipe repeatedly struck Jael and restricted her breathing until she lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she tried to escape, but he had locked the front door. Somehow, she managed to make 2 phone calls, one to her parents and another to Felipe's parents. The first people to arrive were Felipe's mother and father. And this is one of those moments in the case that I genuinely can't wrap my head around. Maria Teresa Larenas, a lawyer who worked within the judicial system, looked at the condition of her son's injured girlfriend. Instead of calling for medical help, she reportedly told Jael to cover the bruises with heavy makeup. She then questioned why Jael had called her own parents at all, insisting that problems like this should be handled quietly and kept within the family. By the time Jael's parents finally arrived, the situation spiraled even further. Felipe grabbed a kitchen knife and rushed toward both Jael and her mother. The 2 women managed to barricade themselves inside the bathroom, while everyone else in the apartment struggled to restrain him. After that night, Jael cut off all contact with Felipe. Fear kept her from going to the police right away. But later, after learning she wasn't the first woman to accuse him of this kind of behavior, she decided to file an official report. That single decision set a lengthy court process in motion, one that would eventually push the engineer from Santiago to look for a desperate way out. On August 9th, 2022, the Chilean courts finally handed down a sentence. For the severe assault on his girlfriend, Felipe was sentenced to 540 days in prison. His defense team later succeeded in reducing that sentence to 250 days, roughly 8 months. But one fact didn't change. A warrant was issued for his arrest. On October 7th, police went to his residence in the Las Condes district to take him into custody. No one answered the door. The building's concierge told officers that the resident hadn't been seen there for quite some time. A month later, on November 20th, authorities tried again at another address in Santiago, but the result was exactly the same. While reviewing customs and border records from that period, I came across something that immediately stood out. There wasn't a single official record showing that the convicted man had ever left Chile. As investigators would later determine, rather than reporting to prison, he illegally crossed into neighboring Argentina, bypassing every official immigration checkpoint. He eventually settled in the southern part of Córdoba, in the upscale Jardín Espinosa neighborhood. To the people around him, he told a convincing story. He claimed he had a well-paying remote job with his father's financial company and had moved because he was tired of the pressure of life in Chile. On the surface, he lived like a wealthy expatriate with nothing to worry about. The only thing that regularly unsettled his new neighbors was an unusual hobby. He began keeping exotic snakes inside his home, leading to frequent disputes with people living nearby. Several months passed. Then, in the early spring of 2023, a new name entered the case. Cristel Veronica Heredia, 34 years old. She had graduated from Universidad Siglo XXI with a degree in public relations and worked in the administrative department of the major radio broadcasting company, Grupo Shopping. Everyone who knew her described her the same way. Kind, open-hearted, and always willing to help others. That spring, Cristel took a short vacation and traveled to Santiago. And through what seems like an almost impossible coincidence, the fugitive happened to be there during those very same days. You're probably asking the obvious question. How could someone who was supposed to be wanted by authorities casually travel back to Chile to visit family? The answer lies in yet another legal failure. In February of that same year, for reasons that remain difficult to explain, a Chilean judge revoked the arrest warrant and ordered additional psychiatric evaluations. In effect, The system simply lost track of him, allowing him to cross international borders without any interference. Their first meeting was as ordinary as it gets. They matched on a dating app. An educated, well-spoken man with a successful career quickly made a strong impression on Christelle. The biggest thing they had in common was geography. They discovered they were both living in Córdoba, Argentina. After spending time together in Santiago, they returned to Argentina as a couple, and not long afterward, they officially began their relationship. Christelle truly believed she had found a dependable partner. She had no idea she was inviting a convicted repeat offender with a long history of aggressive behavior into her life. That single swipe on a dating app started a countdown that would eventually lead to the scene we saw in the bedroom on Catamarca Street. After returning from the trip, they moved in together in Córdoba and began building a life as a committed couple. From the outside, everything looked like the beginning of a happy and stable future. Christelle's family, including her brother Maximiliano Heredia, welcomed Felipe with open arms. To them, he seemed like the ideal partner, highly educated, polite, confident, and able to carry on a conversation with just about anyone. Maximiliano would later describe those conversations in detail. Felipe constantly talked about his international travels, emphasized his family's high social standing in Santiago, and hinted at substantial financial wealth. He claimed he worked remotely for his father's investment firm, giving him both a flexible schedule and an excellent income. At one point, Maximiliano asked him a straightforward question. If he had so many opportunities, why choose to live in Córdoba instead of somewhere more prestigious? Felipe's answer sounded perfectly reasonable. He said he was looking for a quieter life, wanted to get away from the constant pressure of Chilean society, and hoped to enjoy his financial independence somewhere more peaceful. Christelle's family believed every word. It never crossed their minds that the man sitting in front of them was a fugitive with an official psychiatric diagnosis and a long history of violent attacks. What was actually happening behind the closed doors of their apartment only became known because of one person. Susana Corti had been one of Christelle's closest friends for more than 2 years. Despite the difference in their ages, the two women were extremely close, and Susana became the only person who witnessed how quickly that picture-perfect relationship turned into a pattern of control. Just a few months after they started living together, Felipe's familiar behavior began to surface again. As I worked through the case files, one thing became impossible to ignore. The pattern was remarkably consistent. He always followed the same cycle, only the women in his life changed. Even his very first girlfriend, whom he dated for about 4 years during high school, had described his obsessive jealousy. Back then, people dismissed it as ordinary teenage insecurity. But by adulthood, that behavior had evolved into something far more extreme, an all-consuming paranoia. It started with endless interrogations inside their apartment in Córdoba. Any mention of Christelle's past relationships triggered intense outbursts of anger from Felipe, almost exactly the way investigators say he had behaved with Jael in Santiago. Before long, the questioning turned into restrictions. He became obsessed with the fact that Christelle regularly went to the gym. His reasoning was as irrational as it was controlling. He didn't want her wearing fitted workout clothes because he believed they attracted too much attention. The constant arguments, criticism, and baseless accusations slowly wore her down. Instead of walking away, Christelle began making compromises. One by one, she gave up the routines and interests she enjoyed, hoping to avoid the next confrontation at home. Susana, who had survived an abusive relationship herself, recognized every warning sign. More than once, she urged her friend to pack her things, leave, and never look back. Christelle admitted to Susana that she was emotionally exhausted. Their relationship hadn't even reached its first anniversary, yet she already felt completely drained. but she couldn't bring herself to take the final step. That's when Felipe reached for the most effective tool in a manipulator's playbook. Every time Christelle talked about ending the relationship, the confident businessman from an influential family suddenly changed his approach. He told her that if she left him, he would immediately end his own life. Just think about how calculated that was. A man who, just a few years earlier, had been accused of forcing his way through doors and chasing people with a kitchen knife, was now presenting himself as the helpless one. He targeted Christelle's greatest strength, her kindness and empathy. The emotional manipulation worked every time. She stayed because she was terrified that leaving might push him to harm himself, trapping herself inside a prison no one else could see. At the very same time, Chile's judicial system had completely lost track of the fugitive, effectively leaving him free to do whatever he wanted. The trap had closed. And with each passing day, the calendar moved closer to June 2024. Now we return to Sunday, June 16th, 2024. Christelle's family had gathered to celebrate Father's Day. Everyone was there, waiting for the couple to arrive. But time kept passing, and they never showed up. Phone calls went unanswered. Before long, concern turned into alarm. It became clear that this wasn't a simple delay. Something was seriously wrong. Her relatives drove to the apartment building on Catamarca Street, only to find police tape blocking access to apartment 1A. Now that we know what happened in Santiago back in 2021, the events in Cordoba take on a very different meaning. This wasn't a sudden loss of control. It was the same pattern repeating itself. A man who had spent years exercising total control over his partners was now facing the moment when that control began to slip away. According to investigators, the morning started with yet another episode of irrational jealousy. This time, however, the verbal aggression that had always allowed him to dominate Christelle no longer had the effect he expected. He then escalates from verbal aggression to physical force. The blows are delivered with overwhelming intensity, meant to eliminate any resistance. And this is an important detail. For Felipe, this isn't simply a fight. It's a demonstration of absolute control. Once it becomes clear that Christelle is no longer able to resist, even passively, he changes tactics and reaches for a weapon. The injuries later documented in detail by forensic specialists point to deliberate actions. None of them appear random. Investigators concluded that each one reflected a clear intent to end the life of the person who had dared to stand up to him. So what happens inside the apartment after everything goes quiet? Felipe realizes there's no way to make this disappear through family money or influential connections. A man who had spent years believing he could avoid consequences immediately begins building a new defense. Every move appears calculated. He doesn't hide the weapons or try to clean up the scene in the traditional sense. Instead, he takes the knife and inflicts several cuts on himself. This isn't an attempt to end his own life. It's an attempt to change the narrative. With those self-inflicted injuries, he tries to transform himself from the aggressor into someone who had supposedly been driven to desperation. He covers Christelle's body with a jacket, as if trying to separate himself from what had just happened. At first glance, it almost looks like an act of compassion. But investigators would later view it very differently. It appears to support the image of someone acting in an emotional breakdown, exactly the version of events he hoped investigators would believe. Then he picks up the phone. His call to emergency services isn't a desperate plea for help. It's the final step in the story he's trying to construct. He believes that the self-inflicted injuries and his willingness to remain at the scene will become powerful arguments in court, helping him avoid the harshest possible sentence. When police officers walk through the apartment door, they don't just encounter a suspect. They see a man doing everything he can to appear confused, overwhelmed, and emotionally broken. He waits for the handcuffs, convinced that this carefully staged version of events will once again shield him from the full consequences of his actions. He truly believes the plan will work one more time. Ask yourself this: how convinced would someone have to be of their own untouchability to believe that, after an act like this, they could still receive a lighter sentence by relying on the very same tactics that had worked during previous legal battles? His behavior wasn't the result of shock. It reflected cold, deliberate calculation. He left the scene almost exactly as it was, expecting the same familiar strategy for escaping accountability to work yet again. But the investigators in Cordoba saw something entirely different. They didn't see a broken man. They saw a suspect facing charges for an especially aggravated crime. At that moment, one chapter of Felipe's life came to an end, and another began. One where the rules were no longer written by influential relatives, but by the criminal justice system of an entirely different country. After his arrest, events unfolded in a way that had become familiar for his family. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated homicide, one of the most serious offenses under Argentine law, carrying the harshest possible penalty. Public pressure for justice grew rapidly in both Argentina and Chile, but the defense wasted no time revealing what it believed would be its strongest card. Then Felipe's mother steps into the public spotlight. She insists that her son is not a monster, but a man living with a serious psychiatric condition. Very quickly, the court is presented with reports from Felipe's psychiatrist, who claims he had been treating him since 2020 for bipolar disorder and significant personality disorders. According to the defense, Felipe had been hospitalized 4 times over the previous 3 years. The strategy is obvious. The goal is to shift the focus away from a calculated criminal act and present him as a patient who needs specialized treatment rather than a prison sentence. Looking at everything that happened before this case, it starts to feel like a pattern that had been refined over the years. Aggression, scandal, medical records, and another attempt to avoid full accountability. But this time, no stack of psychiatric reports could bring Cristel back. Long before these events unfolded, a Chilean prosecutor made a statement in court that now sounds almost prophetic. He warned that Felipe's pattern of aggression was continuing to escalate, and that the next woman who entered a relationship with him could lose her life. At the time, that warning was ignored. The system allowed his family's influence and connections to carry more weight than the safety of the people around him. Unfortunately, that prediction came true. Now everything depends on whether the Argentine court is willing to look beyond the medical narrative presented by the defense and see what investigators believe truly happened inside the apartment on Catamarca Street. In the end, this story is not really about psychiatric diagnoses. It is about a system that gave one man years of opportunities to keep committing crimes, turning each new victim into another statistic. We have now gone through every verified fact in this case. The timeline is complete, the pieces finally fit together, and everyone can decide for themselves where the biggest failure in this chain of events truly occurred.